Mega Drive profile. Welcome to the next level.
It's been a long time since the last episode of MDP, but today we are talking about Gaiares, one of my favorite shooters on the console. Now, I won't waste any more of your time. Let's get to it.
Gameplay.
Gaiares is a horizontal shoot 'em up by Telenet Japan. It's known for being one of the more standout titles early in the Mega Drive's lifespan, with a very good reason. You'll hear more about why later. The story is somewhat substantial on its own. The year is 3000. Humans have polluted the earth immensely. Pirates, also known as Gulfers, plan to use these emissions to fuel weapons of mass destruction. In order to combat this, the United Star Cluster of Lizeluf would be forced to destroy the Earth's sun. Deciding to give humans a chance to save their planet, the Federation requests a human by the name of Dan Dare to pilot an experimental ship they've created. This ship is equipped with a technology called the TOZ system. Dan is assisted by a young emissary named Alexis, who would serve as a navigator for this device. It's up to them to tackle the pirate forces and save Earth. Gaiares consists of 8 stages with a middle and final boss in each. Controlling your ship is quite simple. Press C to shoot, press B to change ship speed, and A to deploy the TOZ system. In the common shmup, destroying enemies or picking up items would be the standard way to acquire or power up weapons. In Gaiares, you must shoot your TOZ pod at enemies in order to steal their abilities. It's quite similar to R-Type. On the top left of the status bar, you can see what weapon you have and the amount of power it contains. To increase the power of your guns, shoot your TOZ at the same enemy type until the bar is full. Because there are many types of enemies, therein lies many types of weapons to acquire. The TOZ can also boost defensive items found throughout the stages. These items include a shield, bomb, and max weapon. A normal shield can take 3 hits, while a max shield can take 5. With this neat gun system, however, comes its pros and cons. Deploying your TOZ leaves you unable to shoot very briefly. Moving your ship around is viable, but mere half seconds are crucial. Although your pod can absorb bullets and kill weak enemies, shooting it on purpose is simply not practical. Think of it more like a safety net in case you miss your target. Back at the status bar remains the life counter and ship speed. There are 3 different speeds: low, mid, and max. The option to switch speeds is not present for the player's comfort. It's actually needed to progress and beat certain bosses. There are times where having a certain weapon or being at a particular speed will help, but the opposite is also true. For example, having the G-beam will do me no good since debris and bullets are coming from all angles in this footage. But if I acquire this missile power-up, management becomes easier. As for lives, you start with 3 and can gain one by attaining a certain amount of points. If you lose all lives, you have 4 continues to rely on. Dying in Gaiares is a punishment on its own, because doing so strips you of your acquired weapon and sends you back to the last checkpoint. Depending on the stage, checkpoints can be rough. For example, if you die, you'll need to quickly steal a new gun, max it out, and pray it will be effective. Mini bosses are frequent and they will cut you no slack. If a mini boss gives you trouble, then prepare yourself for the main one. Stage bosses are absolutely relentless in every sense of the word. Much like normal enemies, positioning is where their attacks are geared against. Memorizing their patterns is essential, but understand that they will slightly deviate when least expected. Going to the options menu won't change anything either, since the normal difficulty is essentially hard mode, with the other setting being very hard. The point I am trying to make is that Gaiares is extremely challenging, and if you think it will hold your hand, then prepare to be disappointed. Memorization alone will not guarantee victory. It only plays a small part, since the difficulty is based around player positioning. Even trying to outsmart a boss with a cheesy tactic, and you'll be reminded of your mistake. Reflexes are the real verdict for prosperity in Gaiares. Most reviewers online have lamented on the fact that they can hardly make it past the second stage, and some have even resorted to using a cheat device to progress any further. I want you to know that the game is not impossible to complete legitimately. Patience, determination, and raw skill will prevail in the end. Okay, so is Gaiares a good game? Absolutely. Would I recommend this to everyone? It really depends. It's clear to me that Gaiares was designed for the hardcore shmup player. It holds nothing back from beginning to end. Newcomers should clear other shooters first and then give Gaiares a try. I think it's worth it, in my opinion.
Graphics.
When the Mega Drive launched in Japan, the titles available at the time were already better looking than what the NES had, due simply to better hardware. 2 years later, and Nintendo would be launching the SNES in order to even the score. The Super Famicom had great launch titles respectively, but the Genesis needed to increase its graphical showcase in order to assert their dominance. Third-party developers like Compile and Technosoft have been coming to grips with the console's hardware since launch, and it seemed that the year 1990 would spark premier shooters, Gaiares being one of these. One of the cool things off the bat is the extensive anime cutscenes. Leaving the game idle will trigger them, and they go on to explain the plot of the game. All drawings look nice and colorful, accompanied by awesome music to draw the atmosphere. According to lead designer Koji Yokota, the cartridge size was initially 4 megabits, but had to be doubled to 8 in order to accommodate for the visuals and story. If the visuals had your eye, then the game itself will definitely capture you. Gaiares features extensive use of a technique called parallax scrolling. For those who don't know, parallax scrolling is basically where a background sprite moves more slowly than a foreground graphic, creating an illusion of depth. All stages contain this simple yet effective technique, along with other cool tricks like sprite warping and scaling. Backgrounds are something that I personally noticed in this game, especially while fighting certain bosses. Speaking of which, the bosses are super cool. A majority of them are screen size and feature decent animation. My favorite boss is Death Ghetto and the Yellow Dragon. The art style has a real science fiction vibe with elements of fantasy. I mentioned this because Telenet is also responsible for Valis, another Genesis game with a very similar art direction. All in all, Gaiares is somewhat of a different take on shooter settings. A nice accommodation for the gameplay if I say so myself.
Music and sound.
The music for Gaiares is composed by Shinobu Ogawa, an in-house musician for Telenet Japan. He was responsible for scoring other games at the company, like Valis and its sequels. To be perfectly honest, if you were to take a score for a Valis game and paste it onto Gaiares, you'd still be left with a pretty fitting soundtrack, as Ogawa's style of music did not change, even with the shift in genre. Brassy choruses and deep bass melodies are quite prevalent, and for whatever reason, it just works as intended. Percussion consists of PSG usage instead of PCM samples, most likely to save space as the cutscenes were already consuming enough memory as it is. I don't have much else to add, so let's check out the music that defines Gaiares.
development and philosophy.
Gaiares was developed by Telenet Japan, a software and game studio founded in the early 80s. Eventually, it broke into several subsidiaries, such as Wolf Team and Renovation Products. Renovation Products was essentially the US version of Telenet. No games were made here, as its only purpose was to localize games. Sega requested Telenet to make a game for them. Yokota, the lead designer of Gaiares, was approached by a colleague who had been working on a shooting project. Intrigued, he joined him and spearheaded development. The team took an influence from the classic shooter R-Type, as Yokota explains. It didn't exist before, capturing directly from enemies. The idea was to evolve the way the one used the option module from R-Type. You apply it to an enemy to extract that enemy's individual characteristics. Originally, we had a weapon where you shoot an object, like a ball, at the power-up items to collect them, and also switching weapons in real time. But then we came up with the option idea, and that led to the idea of ramming enemies to capture weapons. If you're trying to capture something from the enemy, you cannot attack them. So we designed it as a sort of risk-reward mechanic for the player. Yokota goes on to elaborate on why the final stages had recycled bosses and enemies, an observation game reviewers lamented on. I was only involved in the first 6 stages, and I was not involved in the last few. You can probably tell if you play the game, but there is a significant change in the bosses. The last few stages were mainly done by Yamamoto-san and a designer at Nihon Telenet. It seems as though they recycled some of the monsters, which was criticized and ultimately led to the game receiving low review scores. As I mentioned earlier, Gaiares is known for its challenging difficulty, and it is something that Yokota is comprehensive about. Yamamoto-san, the programmer, was in charge of the game balance, but it was originally intended for the overseas market. Since there's a tendency to play a game and then sell it, as well as rental systems, the overseas publisher, Renovation, asked us to make the game more difficult so it would not be rented and completed easily. When we went over to show them the demo, they said, "You should make it even more difficult." We started getting concerned at this point, but we complied. So ultimately, the game became very difficult. In retrospect, this practice is pretty backhanded, but they are not the only ones to embrace this. In one of the promotions for the game, a young man sporting a mullet is wearing a t-shirt that says, "Can you say Guy are us?" These promos ended being something that a lot of players from the time remember, so I guess in a sense it worked. Interestingly enough, there is a meaning to the title Gaiares as explained by Yokota. I came up with the name Gaiaresu. The resu part stands for L-E-S-S, or less, as in to be without. So, without Gaia, or Earthless, since Earth has been ruined, and humanity is trying to figure out a solution. I was only in charge of coming up with the basic setting. I placed importance on the game itself, and I didn't think much about the story. Perhaps it's because the characters are reviving Earth, so that's why English players thought the rest stood for rescue as opposed to less. I'd also like to add that during development, the game was named Astion before making the switch to Gaiares. It's clear that the name change was made to coincide with the story. Gaiares was released on December 26, 1990 in Japan and in February of 1991 in the US. It's one of the very few Mega Drive titles to not see a PAL release, and it's unknown as to why. In the very same month, another classic by the name of Musha would also see its debut on the console, an interesting fact. Gaiares is definitely a veteran's game, and it makes sense since Sega became a hallmark for challenging titles in the 16-bit era. Along with this challenge came greatness, further cementing the Mega Drive as the go-to platform for shooters, or perhaps even starting it.